$800. That is what one of the three co-founders of Apple accepted in exchange for his 10% stake in the company, 12 days after helping create it. Today, Apple is worth over $4 trillion. That same 10% stake would be worth somewhere between $75 and $400 billion. And the man who sold it is 91 years old, living off Social Security checks and renting out part of his house to make ends meet. This is the story of Ronald Wayne, the forgotten founder of Apple, and arguably the most expensive decision in the history of business. Most people know the Apple founding story as a two-man show. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, two college dropouts who changed the world from a garage in California. But for the first 12 days of Apple's existence, there were three names on the founding document. The third was Ronald G. Wayne. In April 1976, Wayne was 41 years old, significantly older than Jobs and Wozniak, and was working as an engineer at Atari, where he had befriended Steve Jobs. Jobs recruited Wayne for a specific purpose, to help persuade the more cautious Steve Wozniak to formalize the launch of Apple Computer Company. Wozniak respected Wayne, he trusted his judgment, and Wayne delivered. Not only did Wayne help convince Wozniak, he also typed up the founding partnership agreement himself. He drew Apple's very first logo, a detailed woodcut-style illustration of Sir Isaac Newton sitting beneath a tree with an apple dangling above his head. And for all of this, he received a 10% stake in the company, while Jobs and Wozniak each took 45%. On April 1, 1976, three signatures appeared on that document. One of them was Ronald G. Wayne. For 12 days, he was one of the three co-founders of Apple. So why did he walk away? The answer is not stupidity, it is fear. And in the context of 1976, it was a rational fear. Steve Jobs had borrowed $15,000 to complete a purchase order for 50 to 100 computers from a retail outlet called the Byte Shop, a store with a known history of not paying its suppliers. Wayne's concern was blunt. If those computers did not sell and the Byte Shop did not pay, someone had to cover the $15,000 debt. And under the partnership agreement they had signed, each partner could be held personally liable for the full amount of any obligation the company could not meet. Jobs was 21 years old and had virtually no assets. Wozniak was 25. Wayne, at 41, had a house. He had savings. He had something to lose. If we didn't get paid, Wayne recalled years later, how are we going to pay back $15,000? He had also previously been burned in a failed business venture, a slot machine company that had left him with debts he had spent years repaying. He was not willing to go through that again. So 12 days after signing, he went back to Jobs and Wozniak and sold his stake back to them for $800. He later received an additional $1,500 to formally forfeit any future claim to the company, bringing his total payout to $2,300. In January 2026, that same founding document, the one bearing his signature, sold at a Christie's auction for $2 million. The paper was worth more than he was paid for the company it created. Now for the number that stops everyone cold. Apple's market capitalization today stands at over $4 trillion. A 10% stake, had Wayne held it from day one, would theoretically represent $400 billion in value. The realistic figure is lower because dilution is real. As Apple brought in outside investors, went public in 1980, and issued new shares over the decades, Jobs and Wozniak's own stakes were diluted significantly. Wayne would have faced the same dilution. Conservative estimates place his stake's current value at somewhere between $75 and $150 billion after accounting for that dilution. Still an almost incomprehensible number. To put it in perspective, $75 billion would make Ronald Wayne one of the 10 wealthiest people in the world. He would be richer than most sovereign wealth funds, richer than the GDP of most countries. Instead, he collects his monthly Social Security check and has said, without apparent bitterness, "I have never been rich, but I have never been hungry either." Here is what makes Ronald Wayne's story genuinely remarkable. At 91 years old, he says he has no regrets. In a recent interview with Fortune magazine, Wayne leaned into the irony of his situation with remarkable composure. He offered this reflection to younger generations. Understand your risk in practice, not just on paper. Have counsel. It is the advice of a man who made a calculated decision, accepted the outcome, and chose not to spend 50 years torturing himself over it. He has said on multiple occasions, "If I had stayed with Apple, I probably would have wound up the richest man in the cemetery." And he means it genuinely, not as self-consolation, but as a real acknowledgement that the stress, the uncertainty, and the years of risk that Jobs and Wozniak endured were enormous. Wayne was not built for that ride. He knew it then. He knows it now. In a strange final twist of irony, in April 2026, 50 years after he typed up Apple's founding contract, Wayne partnered with Anheuser-Busch for a campaign around a different kind of Apple product. The forgotten co-founder of the world's most valuable company, lending his name to a beer brand. History has a sense of humor. Ronald Wayne's story is not really about money. It is about risk tolerance and how the same piece of information can look completely different depending on where you are standing. In 1976, walking away from Apple was a sensible decision made by a cautious, experienced man who had been burned before and could not afford to be burned again. In 2026, it looks like the greatest financial mistake in human history. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Most people, faced with the same information at the same moment, would have done exactly what Ronald Wayne did. And that is perhaps the most uncomfortable lesson of his story. The difference between extraordinary wealth and an ordinary life is sometimes not intelligence, not talent, and not hard work. It is simply the willingness or the ability to sit with uncertainty long enough for something extraordinary to happen. Hit like if this story made you think, and subscribe for more deep dives like this one.